I want to say a few more things about the conquest. We talked about the different phases of the conquest. Joshua enters the land, leads Israel across the Jordan, and conquers Jericho, which is in the central part of the land, eventually conquers Ai, and then the Gibeonites come into the picture. The Gibeonites get attacked, and Joshua goes to rescue them from the attack. And in order to secure that victory against the southern kings, he conquers the territory of those southern kings. And then the conquest of the north happens in a similar way, that Israel gets attacked directly, and then in fighting off that attack from the Canaanites, Joshua conquers the northern territories. So central territory south and then north, that's the movement of the conquest. I wanted to highlight some things that are important for understanding the nature of the conquest, and particularly the similarities between the Exodus and the conquest. There's a continuity between the Exodus from Egypt and the conquest, in the sense that the reason for the Exodus, the ultimate reason for the Exodus, was to bring Israel out of Egypt and to plant them in the land that the Lord had promised to Abraham. So until Israel gets into the land, the Exodus sequence is not really finished. So there's that in that sense, there's a completion to the book of Joshua. What happens in Joshua completes the story that began in the book of Exodus. But beyond that, there are similarities in the way that the story, or the way that the dynamics of things that are happening. And I want to highlight one thing in Joshua 11, verses 19 and 20. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel, except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. So that is, they took all the rest of the cities. Why? Verse 24, it was of the Lord to harden the hearts to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Okay. Who does that sound like? An enemy of the Lord who hardens his heart against the Lord. That's obviously an allusion back to the story of Pharaoh, who, when he's confronted by Moses, continually hardens his heart against Moses, offers a partial answer to Moses, but doesn't give Moses everything that the Lord demands. And then whenever the plagues are, the Lord sends a plague, and Pharaoh is remorseful. But when the plague is lifted, then Pharaoh hardens his heart again and won't let Israel go. And finally, in his hardness, he's just destroyed. And the same thing is happening to the Canaanites. The Lord is giving them over to their hardness of heart, as he gave Pharaoh over to his hardness of heart. And the king of Jerusalem attacks Gibeon. When he saw what happened at Jericho and what happened with Gibeon, the alliance, the king of Jerusalem could have said, these people are too powerful for us. Their God is too powerful for us. We should try to make an alliance like the Gibeonites did. But instead, he hardens his heart, and the Lord hardens his heart, so that he continues to resist. And that happens to all the other cities, apart from the Gibeonites, and of course Rahab in the city of Jericho. But the fact that that link with the Exodus, I think, is important for understanding the way that the conquest might have gone. Verse 19 says, there was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel, except the Hivites living in Gibeon, which suggests that other cities might have done that. Other cities could have done that. If Israel goes into the land and all the cities suddenly said, we want to serve the Lord. Don't destroy us. We want to serve the Lord. We'll destroy our own idols. We'll tear down our own shrines. That would have accomplished the same thing. That would have purged the land of idolatry. But the Canaanites refused to do that, and so they're conquered. But the aim, or at least one effect of the conquest, is to incorporate some Gentiles into Israel. And that's one of the parallels with the book of Exodus, with the story of Exodus. when Israel leaves Egypt, it's emphasized several times that they left with a mixed multitude. That is, they not only had the direct descendants of Jacob. Jacob came down at the end of Genesis, the beginning of Exodus. Jacob and his family came down, 12 sons with their families. There's 70 persons that are total that are directly descended from Jacob in that company, 70 people. And probably several thousand others who are associated with them, but 70 direct descendants. They're in Egypt for a couple hundred years, and then all these plagues begin to come. And after the first several plagues, Israel is spared during the plagues, and the Egyptians suffer the brunt of the plagues. Now, if you were an Egyptian living in that circumstance, and here's a plague of darkness, everything in Egypt is dark, but over there in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites are, it's not dark. Over here, we've got hail destroying all our crops, but they're not getting hail over there in Goshen. If you're an Egyptian, you might think, I want to be over there, right? I want to be with that God. Obviously, Pharaoh and the gods of Pharaoh can't protect me from this God over there. There are a lot of Egyptians that end up leaving with Israel when they go out of Egypt. It's a mixed multitude. It's not just direct descendants of Jacob. It's Jews, direct descendants, blood descendants of Jacob, and also Gentiles incorporated into Israel. And that's what is happening to a small extent, at least, in the time of the conquest. You have Rahab, who is, of course, the prostitute in Jericho, who helps the spies in Jericho. She deceives her own king. She's a resident of the city of Jericho, but she deceives the king of Jericho and the soldiers of the king of Jericho and in order to rescue the spies. She's basically committing treason against her own king in order to be on the good side of Israel and Israel's God. And the reason she does that is because she knows about the Exodus. She knows about what the Lord has done. If you look back at Joshua 2, I think this is quite a remarkable confession. This is Rahab after she's hidden the spies up in the roof of her house. The soldiers of the king of Jericho are looking for them, but she's hidden them. And now she sent out the soldiers the other way. Oh, they went that way. Go follow them. And then this is what she says to them, Joshua 2:8 and following. Excuse me. Before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land. This is a prostitute of Jericho who confesses the Lord as the possessor of the land. And the terror of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. Why? We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you went and came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are beyond the Jordan. This is in the Transjordan area that Moses conquered. Sihon and Og, those two kings are the kings that were conquered in the Transjordan area, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and we had no courage remained in us in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. Okay. She's saying, well, first of all, this is a confession, a remarkable confession, coming from a Gentile prostitute in Jericho, a Canaanite. But the shape of her confession, the reason for her devotion to Yahweh is remarkable. She says that the people of the land of Canaan have known about Israel all the way back to the time of the Exodus. For 40 years, they've been quaking, fearing the Israelites because of what happened in Egypt. Rahab seems to remember the Exodus better than some of the Israelites do. When you think about what happened in the book of Numbers when the original 12 spies went over into the land, and Caleb and Joshua came back and they said, the Lord will be with us, we can conquer. The other 10 spies said, we can't. Well, Rahab is describing the attitude of the Canaanites. We were melting in fear. And yet Israel wouldn't go in and conquer the land because they were afraid. They were afraid of the Canaanites who were afraid of them. So for a generation, Rahab and the people that she's associated with have known about the Exodus. The Exodus has made the rounds. It's a story that's been told all around the area. Footnote, thinking ahead to 1 Samuel, when the Ark of the Covenant gets moved around from city to city in Philistia, the Philistines say, "Yikes, it's the Ark of the Covenant. This is the God who brought plagues to Egypt." The Philistines know about the Exodus. Hundreds of years later, they know that God is the God of the Exodus, and they fear the God of the Exodus. So her faith in Yahweh is because of the Exodus. Take a moment if you later on to compare this little speech of Rahab with the song of Miriam in Exodus 15, the song that the Israelites sing after they've crossed over the Red Sea. And there are parallels between the two. What the Israelites are singing about, the Lord's conquest, his enthronement and all the nations are going to hear this and fear. That's exactly what's happening to Rahab. And it's been happening for decades. Okay. So she confesses Yahweh. By the way, I frequently use the word Yahweh. That is a way of transliterating the Hebrew name of God. YHWH is the unvocalized form of that. I do that because it's translated in most English translations as Lord with all caps, which makes it sound like the name like that word is a title. But it's not a title, it's a personal name. It's the name that Israel uses to invoke the Lord. They call on Yahweh in the way that Greeks would have called on Zeus, or Philistines would have called on Dagon. They had personal names for their gods. Yahweh is the God of Israel. So I just explain why I use that name. I think it's helpful to mentally at least translate whenever you see Lord in all capital letters, translate it into that name, because it's not talking about a title or status. It's talking about a particular God who's identified himself to Israel and revealed his name. Okay, so she confesses Yahweh is the God in heaven and on earth beneath, and she asks the spies to rescue her. So now we got this right at the beginning of the conquest, before Israel has conquered anything. These are just two spies kind of checking out the land and seeing the state of things in Jericho. And before that, you already have this Gentile convert and her household are brought into Israel. She's incorporated into the line of Judah, and she becomes an ancestor of Jesus. She's in the genealogy in Matthew 1. She's in the genealogy at the end of Ruth, I think, too. Well, at least she's implied. I don't know that she's named, but she's named in the genealogy in Matthew. She's an ancestor of Jesus. This Gentile Canaanite prostitute confesses the Lord, shifts her loyalties from the king of Jericho and the gods of Jericho to Israel and the God of Israel, and the Lord saves her. One thing I should say, Rahab is famous for telling lies, and often there are Bible teachers condemn her for telling lies. I think that what she does here is a righteous deception. There is such a thing as a righteous deception. I think this is what the midwives in Egypt are doing when they tell Pharaoh that the Israelite women are giving birth too fast. We can't control their birth process, but they're doing that so they can cover and rescue the boys. This is a tactic that's used regularly in what David uses deception regularly during his lifetime in order to protect himself from Saul and from other enemies. And I think the theological background of this is back in Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, the serpent tempts Eve and deceives her, and she sins. And the judgment on the serpent and on serpent-like characters in the Bible is that they are deceived in turn. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound, deception for deception. Satanic rulers often Pharaoh is a satanic ruler. He's trying to destroy Israel. It's perfectly legitimate to protect people who are being destroyed using deception. The same thing is true with Rahab. I think she's perfectly justified in deceiving her own king and protecting the spies. Yes. Well, I think a part of it has to do with the circumstances in which it's being done. These are wartime, intense conflict situations. People's lives are at stake, and the killers are, Pharaoh in the one instance is a wicked, God-hating king. So in that kind of wartime situation, in everyday life, using deception is, the Bible doesn't approve. The Bible condemns deception and lying as an everyday activity and in interpersonal relations. We're supposed to be truthful and forthright. But in these kinds of circumstances of conflict and persecution and attack, deception is a legitimate tactic. Just another note on that, you might have a follow-up. If you look a few chapters ahead in Joshua, I mentioned the Battle of Ai. The first time Israel goes against Ai, Ai wins. They take care of the sacrilege in the camp. They execute Achan, and then they go out and fight Ai again. But the way they do it, the Lord gives them this battle plan. They begin to attack Ai, and then the men of Ai come out and they flee as if they're being beaten. Meanwhile, there's some other Israelites camouflaged over here, and as soon as the men leave Ai, this group comes out and attacks the city and starts to burn it, and then they attack from the city toward the camp, and the Israelites who are running away turn around, and the men of Ai are just caught in the middle between these two Israelite companies. Okay, that's a deceptive military tactic, right? You pretend like you're beaten and you're not. You're running away, but that's a deceptive tactic that the Lord reveals to Joshua. The Lord tells Joshua to do that. So I think it's in those kind of circumstances that we find deception being used righteously. It's in those. David uses it, for example, when he, he uses it quite regularly, he escapes from Saul when Saul's searching for him. He lays out a household idol in a bed and pretends to be ill, but escapes through a window. But he's preserving his life. He deceives Achish, the king of Philistia, when he goes into the Philistines, pretending to be mad. He's not mad, insane, but he pretends to be mad so that Achish doesn't. I don't think it's Achish. I think it's another Philistine king. But he deceives another ruler who is a threat to his life. So I think it's in those kind of battle situations. So I think the kinds of situations that I think these passages would apply today. I'm sure there are situations in Africa where there are, what do you do if you're a Nigerian Christian and you have Boko Haram or some other Islamic group invading the village? Do you use deception in order to protect people? Is that a legitimate tactic? I think it is. In a lot of cases, this needs to be said too. In a lot of cases, deception cannot be used. If you're standing before an executioner and they say, "Do you confess Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of God?" You have to say yes. You don't. That's the time for your martyrdom. That's the time for your martyrdom, right? Then you're called to die for Christ. But if there are ways to use tactics to protect lives and protect the church, then that's a legitimate consideration. Not always the right one, but a legitimate tactic. Yeah. I admit that's an ambiguous one. I'll offer a case in favor of Jacob there, though. First of all, a general point about Jacob. I know this is outside of the scope of our course, but you brought it up. I'm just following So who is Jacob? We think of Jacob as a deceiver, a really bad guy who finally gets saved maybe toward the end of his life when he wrestles with God. The Bible says that Jacob is a perfect man at the beginning of his life. This is in Genesis 25:27. It doesn't mean he's sinless, but it means he's a mature and godly man. The boys grew up. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field. Jacob was a peaceful man. That actually is the word perfect, living in tents. The word that's sometimes translated as smooth. So in contrast to the hairy Esau, he's got smooth skin. He's not as hairy. The word is perfect. It's the same word that's used for Job. Job is a perfect man. It's the same word that's used in the command to Abraham, walk before me and be perfect. So that doesn't mean that everything Jacob does is right, but it does set up a certain angle on Jacob's life. We should be looking at him as a righteous man, not as a wicked man who's finally changed at the end of his life. So on the deception of his father, the case in favor of Jacob, and I'm not, this would be my position, but I'm not going to argue strenuously for it. I think there is an argument to be made for it. Isaac and Rebekah, parents of Jacob and Esau, have known before the boys were born that the Lord favors Jacob, the younger son. Rebekah favors Jacob. Her favor matches the Lord's favor for Jacob. Isaac favors Esau because Esau gives him tasty food. Okay, he likes. The picture seems to be that Isaac is ruled by his belly. His favor is not determined by what God said about the sons, but by his own desires. He gets good food from Esau, so he favors Esau. That's one point. Second point is the idea of deceiving Isaac comes from Rebekah. It's Rebekah's scheme. And Jacob is following her orders. He could have objected. You could say, if this is a sinful thing, you could say, Mom, I can't do that. It's sinful. But it is Rebekah's. It's Rebekah's plan. I think this is right, but I don't think I can prove it decisively. It seems like Rebekah's intention is to confront Isaac with his error and force him to do the right thing, shock him into recognition of the right son, the son that should be blessed. It's a ruse that's supposed to bring him to recognition. And actually, in that sense, it actually works because Isaac at the end of the story says, no, my blessing is going with Jacob. And he goes through this kind of crisis. So it's possible to read it as Rebekah's scheme to kind of shake Isaac out of his rebellion. I think Isaac is being rebellious against the Lord. And he should be freely passing on the blessing and the birthright to Jacob. And he should have been saying that to Esau from the beginning, So if that's the story you're talking about. The other one, of course, is Jacob himself, who offers. There's no deception there in Jacob getting the birthright from Esau, but what he does is offer a ridiculous deal: a bowl of lentils versus a birthright. Not a good trade for Esau. A really bad trade. But he's hungry. He's ruled by his belly, like his father is. And he's so hungry that he's willing to trade away his birthright for a bowl of stew. And when the Bible talks about this in Hebrews, for example, it talks about Esau being the guilty one. Esau despised his birthright, Hebrews says. It doesn't say Jacob was sinning because he offered this ridiculously bad deal. Esau was sinning because he valued his birthright so little that he was willing to trade it away for a meal. A food sin, kind of like the way things all started. A sin regarding food. Okay, so that would be a take on it. I won't insist on that at the moment, but I think that at least is a plausible way to read the story. Okay. So I was, just to get back on track of what we were talking about, Conquest and Exodus I'm comparing. One of the similarities is that Pharaoh and the Canaanites are similar in their hardness of heart, and in the fact that the Lord hardens their hearts. They get delivered to their hardness of heart, and they resist. But in the midst of that resistance, the Lord is still bringing Gentiles into Israel. So that includes Rahab, and it also includes the Gibeonites, whom I've already talked about. I just want to say one more thing about the Gibeonites, and that is what the last verse of Joshua 9 tells us. Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of Yahweh to this day in the place which he would choose. Okay. So this is the Gentile city, the Canaanite city, that has allied with Israel. They become servants to the Israelites. They're hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation. So they're in kind of a subordinate place. But notice where they're hewing wood and drawing water. At the altar, in the place where the Lord chooses. They become servants to the priests. You know, if you're gonna offer sacrifice, you need wood. And if you're gonna have wood, you need people who are hewing wood. The priests aren't gonna do that. Now the Gibeonites are given this task. If you're gonna have a sacrificial system, you need water. There's sometimes when you are explicitly instructed to wash the offerings before they're put on the altar. But even when you're not explicitly instructed, if you're a priest, you're constantly slaughtering things, and you need to wash your hands and your feet. So who's going to go out out to the nearest well and bring the water back to the tabernacle that they need to keep their hands and feet clean? The Gibeonites are doing that. Okay. So these Gentiles are brought in, not just they are subordinate, but they're not brought in some kind of menial, low. They're not at the bottom of the heap. This is a fairly exalted service that they're performing. The whole calling of Israel is to be a priestly people, right? Exodus 19. You are a kingdom of priests. A priest is a servant in the house of the Lord. Somebody who is a caretaker and a servant in the house of the Lord. The priests of Israel are butlers in the Lord's house. They're the butchers of the Lord's house. They're the bakers of the Lord's house. They maintain the tabernacle and the temple. That's what priests do. And that's Israel as a whole have priestly people because they're the people where the Lord dwells. That's what makes them a priestly people. The Lord dwells among them. The priests, the Aaronic priests, descendants of Aaron, have a special task in the house, but all of Israel is a nation of priests. Now the Gibeonites get to be servants to the nation of priests, servants to the priest of God. That's a very honorable position for them to be in. So, and then, as I mentioned, the Gibeonites they're protected by the Lord to the extent that when Saul kills them, Saul's family has to give up 7 members executed in order to make retribution for the attack on the Gibeonites. They're under the Lord's protection because they're servants of the tabernacle, right? Okay, so that's another similarity between the Exodus and Conquest. The Exodus gathers a Jew-Gentile group that is called Israel, even though many of them, we don't know how many, but many of them are not members of they're not direct descendants of Jacob, but they're all incorporated into Israel. Now we have the conquest with at least a few scattered Gentiles, Canaanites, that are brought into Israel. And those comparisons between the Exodus and the conquest help to answer one of the questions that I asked earlier. which is what is the outcome for Israel after the death of Moses? Moses is out of the picture. Does he have a worthy successor? Will Israel continue on the trajectory that Moses began for them? And the answer is they do. And in fact, Joshua becomes something like a new Moses in the book of Joshua. Okay. Think about, first of all, think back to Numbers when Joshua is selected to be Moses' successor. This is in Numbers 27. The Lord tells him to choose Joshua and to bestow on him a portion of his glory. Moses directly designates and ordains Joshua to be his successor, and he bears some of the authority and glory of Moses himself. What does Joshua do in that capacity? Well, he leads Israel through water, and the crossing of the Jordan is like a new Exodus through the Red Sea. The waters split at the Jordan. Israel crosses through on dry land, just like they split at the time of the Exodus. Joshua leads Israel in a Passover celebration, just like Moses did. Joshua, Itzhakar pointed this out to me, reminded me of this during the break. Before they attacked Jericho, at the end of Joshua 5, came about when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, rather, I indeed come out as the captain of the hosts of Yahweh." Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Okay. That's an encounter with the Lord, like the encounter at the burning bush. You know, wherever the Lord is in glory, that is holy space. The burning bush is holy space, so you remove your shoes. The tabernacle is holy space. So it seems that the priests did their work barefoot. There's no mention of shoes and footwear in the priestly garments. The temple is holy space, and so you remove your shoes in the face of the glory. So Joshua is doing that here before the captain of the Lord's host. It's a kind of angel of the Lord experience. Moses sent spies into the land. Joshua sends spies into the land. So we have this succession, Moses and a second Moses, whose name is Joshua, which is that kind of succession. A successful succession happens a number of times elsewhere in the Bible. To some extent, it happens with David and Solomon, although Solomon eventually breaks all the rules of kingship. Think of this transition from Elijah to Elisha. We'll look at this when we look at Kings later in the week. Elijah does all these great works, transfers a double portion of his spirit to Elisha, and then Elisha does all the stuff Elijah had done. Right? He's like a new Elijah. He's got the spirit of Elijah in him. He's got the mantle of Elijah, and he does Elijah-like miracles. Or think of the transition from John to Jesus. John's the one who starts preaching the kingdom, warning about coming judgment. He baptizes Jesus, and Jesus carries on that proclamation of John. Or climactically, Jesus goes away, and his disciples are left as successors to carry out his mission. Okay, so this is one of the early instances we see of that transition of leadership. That's a successful one, and the way the Bible emphasizes that is by showing these matches. The life of Moses and the life of Joshua match up at a dozen different points. Joshua is like a second coming of Moses, as Elisha is a second coming of Elijah. And like the disciples are a kind of second coming of Jesus. Okay. They do all the things that Jesus did. Same miracles, same message, same suffering, same deliverances, right? All right. So this is a case, unlike the beginning of the book of Judges, this is a case where the succession is successful. So that was all still under the heading of the 3 stages of conquest. And what I want to talk about now is the last page of your notes, if you're following in your notes, and talk a little bit about the distribution of the land. This will be not be nearly as lengthy, but I want to highlight a few things. The first thing I want to note is the structure of this section of Joshua. I have a chiastic outline in your notes. Begins with instructions to Joshua from Yahweh, ends with Joshua's farewell and instructions to Israel. There's mentions of the Transjordanian tribes, of the tribes on the eastern side. First of all, there's in chapter 13, the Transjordanian tribes are told they can go back to their land since they've assisted in the conquest. And then in chapter 22, they build an altar across on the other side of the Jordan, which creates a crisis because there's only supposed to be one altar. And why are they having another one? And they reassure the rest of the tribes that they're not going to offer any burnt offerings. It's just a memorial. It's an altar that's a reminder that they're part of the same people that's on the other side of the Jordan. And then we have Levites and Levitical cities and so on. The thing I wanted to highlight is the center of this section, which is the tabernacle set up at Shiloh. Let me read that in Joshua 18. Then the whole congregation of the sons of Israel assembled themselves at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The land was subdued before them. And there remained there the sons of Israel, 7 tribes who had not divided their inheritance. Joshua said to the sons of Israel, "How long will you put off entering to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you? Provide for yourselves 3 men from each tribe that I may send, that they may arise and walk through the land and write a description of it according to their inheritance. Then they shall return to me. They shall divide it into 7 sections. Judah shall stay in its territory to the south. The house of Joseph shall stay in its territory to the north. You shall describe the land in 7 divisions and bring the description here to me, and I will cast lots for you before the Lord." Okay, so that's how the land is going to be distributed. Judah and Joseph are the 2 sons of Jacob that are highlighted here. Those are the 2 tribes that are being highlighted. Those become the 2 dominant tribes throughout the remainder of Israel's history, through the time of the judges in some ways, but particularly during the time of the monarchy. Judah is the tribe of David. That's the southern kingdoms. Joseph, the tribes of Ephraim. The tribe of Ephraim is the northern kingdom, sometimes called Israel, often called Israel. So those 2 tribes are singled out. But notice how chapter 18 begins. The congregation of the sons of Israel assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. So they've been hauling, the Levites have been hauling the tabernacle from place to place to place to place for several decades through the wilderness. But the goal was always to have it in one place. Once the Lord gives them rest, this is the promise of Deuteronomy 12 that I read earlier today. Once the Lord gives them rest in the land, he will choose a place, and that's the place where his name will dwell, and that's the place where Israel is going to offer sacrifice, where they're going to hold their festivals, where they're going to bring their tithes. That's what's happening here, and this is in the center of the second half of Joshua, the setting up, the location of the tabernacle. This is the positive side of the conquest. The negative side is clearing out all the idols and idol shrines and idolaters, slaughtering them. The positive side is setting up this tabernacle, the Lord's house at Shiloh, and that's where the house of the Lord remains through the couple of centuries that take up the period of Judges. Okay, so this is Joshua's obviously still alive here. This is toward the end of his life. Shiloh becomes the place of the shrine where the ark is located. And when we get to the beginning of 1 Samuel, the tabernacle is still in Shiloh. The ark is still in the tabernacle in Shiloh until the Philistines conquer and seize the ark for a time. And the sanctuary at Shiloh is dismantled and destroyed, never put together again after that crisis. But for about 200 years, Shiloh was the Jerusalem of Israel. It was the place where they would go for all their festivals and the place where they offered sacrifice. The one altar was supposed to be there. And that, again, is the entire aim of the conquest, is to provide that place, a cleansed land where Israel can, where Israel's going to dwell. I'm going to come back and talk about the covenant renewal in just a second, but one other thing I wanted to say about the inheritance of the land. That large parts of this part of Joshua are just geographic descriptions of different parts of the land. The Levites, I mentioned before, do not have a landed inheritance. They're scattered through Israel. Many of them live around the sanctuary in Shiloh. The priests, initially, all the priests would be living around Shiloh where the tabernacle was. Levites are scattered around in various cities around Israel. And then you'll notice, too, on your outline in chapter 20, there is a designation of certain cities that are Levitical cities. So there are, I should look since I'm suddenly not remembering. I think there are 48 of them around the land that are the inheritance of Israel, of the Levites, rather. Yeah, Joshua 21:41. All the cities of the Levites in the midst of the possession of the sons of Israel, 48 cities with their pasture lands. These cities each had surrounding pasture lands, thus it was in all their cities. So the Levites inherit these cities, lands around the cities that support the cities, but they don't inherit a single large tribe, a portion of land, rather. So there's a couple of things going on there. One is that you have, this is part of a judgment. This goes back to the story of Shechem that I mentioned earlier. It's Levi and Simeon who lead the slaughter of the men of Shechem just after they've been circumcised. And because of that, Simeon and Levi are scattered through the land rather than having an inheritance. But for Levi, the Lord turns that to blessing because he chooses Levi as the tribe of the priests. And if they're scattered throughout the land, that means you're never too far from priests and Levites, never too far from this tribe that specializes in teaching the law, in worship, and in guiding the people in faithfulness. Okay, if you've got 48 cities in the land where Levites, they wouldn't be exclusively Levites who lived in the city, but they would be predominantly Levitical cities. You've got 48 of those in a land that's not all that big. You're probably a day's journey, no matter where you are in the land, you're probably a day's journey from a city with a concentration of Levites, teachers. And then each city has Levites that would function, I would guess, function as kind of local pastors in the cities around Israel. Okay, so the scattering of Levi is a judgment, but it's turned to good and turned to a blessing for Israel. Some of those Levitical cities become cities of refuge. Cities of refuge are Levitical cities, but they have a particular role in Israel of providing a safe haven for people men and women, human beings who shed human blood on the land. Okay, so if you shed blood on the land, you can't. That has to have consequences. If you did it deliberately, you have to be executed. If whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. That's the rule coming out of Genesis. If you do it accidentally, then you can go to a city of refuge. You have to be tried by the judges of the city of refuge. If they determine that you weren't intentionally killing somebody, you shed blood accidentally, they'll admit you to into the city of refuge, and you have to stay there until the high priest dies. And when the high priest dies, everyone who's in the cities of refuge can go out. the death of the high priest cleanses the land, so the people who have shed blood on the land can return. Okay, this sounds like somebody else, some other high priest I can think of that kind of, his death cleanses the land. I can't think of who that is. Oh, Jesus. Oh, it was Jesus. Yes, you're right. I was thinking of Jesus. Couldn't remember who that was. Yes, there's a kind of type of the death of the high priest that liberates people who have sinned. That's part of the typology there. But it's also an interesting, just as a political legal system, the law is making a distinction between plotting to kill somebody and manslaughter. Okay, is that a distinction that's familiar to you between murder and manslaughter? Yeah. So the example that's given throughout the Pentateuch is the death by flying axe head. Okay. So if you're chopping in the woods with your buddy, and axe head flies off and crushes his skull and kills him, you weren't doing it deliberately, but still you shed his blood. You've got to go to a city of refuge. It seems to me like the better solution would be to improve your axe technology so that axe heads don't fly off quite so much. But anyway, it's providing justice. The crime, it is a crime. Anytime you shed human blood, even if it's accidental, requires you to be either put to death or confined. There's no overlooking the shedding of human blood, but it provides this merciful distinction for those who didn't do it deliberately. Levitical cities are, some of those Levitical cities are designated as cities of refuge. That's laid out both in Numbers 35 and also here in Joshua 20. The 6 cities of refuge are mentioned. Okay. So the other part of the Levitical inheritance. So they're scattered throughout the land. That's a blessing to Israel. If you have a question about, you remember something from the Torah, you probably don't have a copy at your home. Or, something's happened between you and your neighbor. You borrowed something from him, and you borrowed a donkey to do some work for you, and the donkey died under your jurisdiction. What are you supposed to do about that? You know that there's something in the law that talks about that, but you don't have a copy in front of you. So you go to a specialist in the law, a Levite. And again, there are Levites in 48 cities rather, throughout the land. And then in each city, there are some Levites living. So you can go to these guys who study the Torah all the time. That's what they do. And they can help you sort through what's the proper restitution for that kind of situation. Because the law does cover that. And what the law doesn't cover, they'll try to reason through what the Torah does say and apply it to the situation that you bring. So they're functioning as judges and advisors, as well as leaders of worship and kind of pastors in Israel. So this is part of the provision that God makes for Israel when they enter the land, the scattering of the Levites. The other dimension to it is several times the Bible says that the Levites don't receive an inheritance of the land because the Lord is their inheritance. The Lord is their portion. And the word portion there is the word for a portion of land. Okay? The Lord himself is what most Israelites receive from direct contact with and work in the land, that is their livelihood. The Levites, priests, receive from the Lord. The Lord brings these things to them through tithes and offerings and other things. The Israelites grow their food. They have to bring a tithe of their food to the Levites and priests who live off of that. Firstborn animals have to go to the priests. Priests who are at the tabernacle or a temple later, get meat from the sacrifices. Some sacrifices are completely burned, but a lot of them have meat that's directly given to the priests. And so that's the way that the Lord provides for the Levites. They're not working the land themselves. These are gifts that the Lord gives them through the gift of through the gift of the gifts of the people. So the Lord is the Lord is the portion. That's the word I'm looking for. The Lord is the Levites' portion. Okay. If you're following the notes, I want to go backward somewhat and go to Roman numeral number 2 on page 2 of the notes, which is called Themes of Joshua. And I want to talk a little bit about these different aspects. And I will leave a little bit of time for a break in just a few minutes so that we can all stretch and refresh ourselves. Take a swig of camel milk to get us through the afternoon. I'll just try to cover the first part of this. One of the issues in Joshua that has many dimensions to it is the question of the kind of warfare that Israel conducts in Canaan. It's called Kharam Warfare. It's spelled with just an H there, but it's a hard H, Kharam. Kharam means something utterly devoted to the Lord. Kharam sometimes is used to describe offerings that are devoted to the Lord. It doesn't necessarily mean the killing of things. It doesn't necessarily mean an act of war. It means something that is utterly devoted to God. No passages are coming to mind right at the moment that use it that way. I actually think, we could talk about this tomorrow when we talk about Judges, when Jephthah the judge says that he's going to offer to the Lord whatever meets him when he comes back from battle, and his daughter comes. He offers her as a whole burnt offering or an ascension offering. She is devoted to the Lord. She's Kharam. I don't think that means that he slaughters her on an altar. I think it means that he devotes her to the Lord. She becomes a servant of the tabernacle. I think that's what's happening in that passage. That's probably not the best example, but there are cases where the word Kharam doesn't mean killing necessarily. It just means something that's utterly devoted to the Lord. In a sense, the whole land is being utterly devoted to the Lord. At times, specific cities are utterly devoted to the Lord by the slaughter of the inhabitants of the city and by the torching of the city, so that it becomes, the biblical terminology is like a whole burnt offering, like an ascension offering. The whole city is burned up and is sent to God and ascends to God. And that raises a lot of different questions in our minds. Probably the leading question for many modern people is the question of the morality of this kind of warfare. Is this a just, a godly kind of war to conduct? And there are a lot of Christians, of course, who say, no, this was Israel in a primitive stage. Israel was barbaric. Some people would go so far to say the God of Israel at this time was a barbaric God, a bloodthirsty God. I don't think we have the option of saying that if we believe that the Bible is the Word of God, recording things that God actually said and did. And Deuteronomy, Joshua both make it clear that the Lord himself instructs Israel to do this. We can try to figure out, so that in a sense is the baseline of settling the question about the morality of this. God's commandments are righteous and just, and we're called to obey them. Israel was given this command, righteous and just command from a righteous, just, and holy God, and they were supposed to obey it. And in a sense, again, that kind of settles the morality question, because God is the one who defines what is good and evil. And if God says, go do this, then you better go do it. But I think we need several qualifications or perspectives that might help to explain it. I don't want to explain it away or make it less alarming than it is. It is an alarming thing for God to tell people to do. But I think putting it in biblical context is important. one thing to realize is that this is not the way Israel conducted every war in its history. Okay? These are the wars of conquest. And then in a couple of occasions, later on, Israel is instructed to carry out Kharam War against some opponent. But Deuteronomy 20, I won't take time to read it, but if you look at Deuteronomy 20, you'll find a description of Israel's procedure in kind of normal warfare. And what they do is to offer terms of peace. And if the terms of peace are refused, then they engage in battle. And there are rules about the distribution of plunder. There are rules about who should and should not be executed. But it's not a total destruction, absolute destruction of everything. That's not the way that Israel conducted its warfare normally. It's part of the conquest, and later on when Kharam Warfare is conducted, it's an extension of the conquest in some way. This is part of the purgation of the land, the purging of the land in order to set up the Lord's house in the land. Another thing to think about, Genesis 15, the Lord is promising Abraham that he will inherit the land. You may remember this night vision of Abraham. He cuts animals in pieces, and then he sees this torch passing through. The Lord is making and confirming the covenant promise. And as a promise specifically about the land. This is Genesis 15:13. God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your seed will be strangers in land that is not theirs. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years." That's talking about the Egyptian slavery. "I will judge that nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions." Prediction of the Exodus. "As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete." Okay. So from the time of Abraham to the time of the Exodus and the conquest and the inheritance of the land, that 400-year period is a time when the sin of the Amorite is completed. What does that mean? What's that?
God was patient.
God was patient, yes. Patient with the Amorites, lots of time to repent, but they don't. The sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. In the outcome means that the Amorites are actually going to get worse. Okay? They're not as fully evil as they will be. Now think about that in the context of Abraham. A few chapters after this, Abraham is going to talk to the Lord about Sodom. 2 angels are going to visit Sodom, and the men of Sodom are going to welcome them with Sodomite hospitality. Sodomite hospitality is homosexual rape. That's how they treat strangers in Sodom. Okay. If you come in and you're a stranger, you need to be humiliated. And so that's a great way to humiliate somebody who comes into your town. Lot is living there. Lot is an anti-Sodomite, even though he's living there in Sodom. He shows genuine hospitality, welcomes the men into his house. He's like an Abraham, a compromised Abraham, because he's living in Sodom. But the Sodomites are wicked men who are oppressing strangers in the worst possible way, right? The only worst thing they could do, and maybe not worse, would be just to kill strangers when they enter town. Would that be worse? I don't know. Maybe not. It might be better just to get it over with. Kill me now, rather than have to live with the shame of that. Okay. But the Lord said the sin of the Amorites, the sin of the Canaanites, is not yet complete. That means that what happens in Sodom is not yet as intense oppression, evil, injustice, and sin as it will be 400 years later. So when Joshua comes into Canaan, then the sin of the Amorites has become full. It's filled with Sodomite-like people. That's what Canaan is. Okay? And the Lord has given them, patiently given them 400 years to repent. He's given them the news of the Exodus is spread to Rahab at least. Other people surely know it. That's an opportunity to repent. This people is coming up from Egypt, and they just destroyed Egypt. Their God just destroyed Egypt. And we know that this land is, they want this land. Their God promised this land to them. We should try to get on their good side. They don't, okay? So think about Rahab in that situation, or think about the Gibeonites in that situation, or any person with a certain, Lot in Sodom. Think about somebody in Canaan during the time of the conquest, living in that kind of world where you have Sodom with 400 years of maturing sin and injustice, and Israel comes in and starts destroying these civilizations. If you're a Rahab, you see that as a liberation. Okay, the king of Jericho is a king like the king of Sodom. I think that's the trajectory from Genesis 15 to thinking about what's going on in Joshua. Israel does come in slaughtering people, but they're slaughtering the people like the city of Sodom. Sodom God destroyed with fire from heaven. Now he's sending human beings that are his new fire from heaven to destroy and to burn certain cities in Canaan. Okay, so I think that's an important perspective on what's going on in the Kharam Warfare. And there are two things I'm trying to emphasize there. One is the wickedness of the Canaanite peoples, which is great. The sin of Sodom is so great that the outcry of those who are oppressed in Sodom rises to heaven, and the Lord hears it and responds. That's how bad it is. And now Canaan is even worse. And so that's the situation that the Lord is destroying. The last thing to notice, to remind ourselves of, is that the Lord is the captain of the Lord's host. We read that passage in Joshua 5. The Lord is leading this warfare. In fact, the Lord is the warrior of Israel. There are a number of occasions, Jericho most prominently, when Israel does almost nothing until the battle's already basically won. The Lord is the one who's carrying this out. And he's the one who's condemning the Canaanite cities to death. And he's condemning the Canaanite cities to destruction. He's also claiming the land and all its wealth as his. Okay, so I'm not trying to explain away the challenge of this kind of warfare. I think that's real. I think it's disturbing. It's frightening. This is a God that's not to be trifled with. It's not an indulgent God. This is not a God who will let evil and sin develop indefinitely. He will bring an end to it. That's good news ultimately, that he brings an end to evil. But it's a terrifying and disturbing thing. I don't want to try to diminish that, but I hope that those few comments can at least throw some additional perspective on it. When I come back, I want to talk about Kharam as liturgical warfare, which is another part of the theology of war in Joshua.